World leaders gathered in Germany to discuss security issues amid the escalating conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza. Hello, I'm Anton and this is The Heat. It's considered the Davos of defense. The Munich Security Conference is a yearly gathering of world leaders talking about the most pressing issues in diplomacy and international security. The conference was established after World War II as a venue to discuss policies and prevent conflicts. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke at the event, highlighting China's efforts against the return of a Cold War mentality. Natalie Carney filed this report from Munich.
No stranger to this Munich stage, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi again asserted Beijing's position on major geopolitical issues, including a call for an absolute ceasefire in Gaza and a return to international talks for a two-state solution.
Now there should be a more concerted voice and more unified position. Together we should call for a proper settlement of the issue of Palestine that has been lingering on for more than 70 years. Efforts should be made towards the two-state solution. Only when the two-state solution is realized can the state of Palestine and the state of Israel live in peace with the assurance of the international community.
Wang Yi also met with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock on the sidelines of Saturday's sessions. In 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky last graced this stage, at that time in a suit and tie. On Saturday, 2 years into the conflict with Russia that has dominated discussions here in Munich, he took to the stage again, having to defend why his troops would be withdrawing from the strategic frontline town of Avdiivka.
The decision is right. In order to avoid being surrounded, it was decided to withdraw to other lines. This does not mean that people retreated some kilometers and Russia captured something. It did not capture anything. The ability to save our people and our soldiers is the most important task for us, because this is what protection is.
He addressed what he called a deficit of weapons, particularly in artillery and long-range capabilities, which allows Russia's President Vladimir Putin to intensify strikes against Ukraine. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz reaffirmed his country's continued support for Ukraine and to meeting NATO's requirement of 2% of GDP spent on defense, and encouraged other European countries to do the same.
Because regardless of how Russia's war in Ukraine ends, regardless of the outcome of the upcoming elections on either side of the Atlantic, one thing is absolutely clear. We Europeans must look after our own security, now and in the future.
The security of Sudan, Yemen, and Haiti were also discussed in Munich.
With no end in sight to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Israel increasing its ground offensives in Gaza, and uncertainty surrounding politics in the White House, questions about what global security will look like in the future are becoming more pressing. Natalie Carney for CGTN at the Munich Security Conference.
Well, there is a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. With us in our studio, Klaus Larres is Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Here in Washington, D.C., James Moore is founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government and Society. Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. And from Beijing, we're joined by Victor Ga, who is a chair professor at Soochow University. Welcome to all of you. Victor, let me start with you. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he addressed that conference in Munich. He described China as a stabilizing force in the world today. He also talked about advancing China's relationship with developed countries, as well as those countries of the global south. And he focused, as we heard in that report, on the Gaza crisis as well and how that can be resolved. What is your sense of the speech, and what does it tell us about China's priorities as far as the global security picture is concerned?
Thank you very much. I think the ongoing Munich Security Conference is very important, and Mr. Wang Yi's important speech and his answers to all the questions raised are also very important occasions for China to clarify its own position. I think he is absolutely right. Ever since the founding of the People's Republic of China, in 1947, he emphasized China has never taken any initiative to invade any other country or to occupy land from any other country. And China has always put diplomacy, negotiation as the first choice. And only when diplomacy fails, and only when China is being attacked or threatened by other countries, will China rise up to the occasion and take things into its own hands in solving the problem. I think this is consistent ever since 1947 and 49, and this will remain China's policy of promoting peace, embracing peace, and using the war as the last resort rather than as the first priority. Now, he also emphasized China's position with regard to the ongoing Ukraine war as well as the conflict in Gaza. I think China's position is very clear. Two-state solution will be the only solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the Palestinian borders should be restored back to 1967. Eastern Jerusalem should be the capital city for the state of Palestine. And I think all these are important, but also very straightforward. This is clear-cut. No one should really believe that they can turn the situation up and down. They can occupy Palestinian land in perpetuity, because if you really want to do that, you destroy lasting peace forever in the Middle East, involving the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Arabs. So I think this is the time for all countries involved to do the right thing, to urge for ceasefire, to stop the hostilities, and this applies not to Israel-Palestinian conflict, but more importantly to the Ukrainian war.
James, Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China, he also held a meeting with the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. That meeting was described as, quote, constructive. Minister Wang was also very critical of the U.S. position on decoupling, or de-risking as it's called here in the United States. He said that would be a historical mistake. But still, these two sides continue to talk to each other. What's your view on these continuing contacts and also what it does for the bilateral relationship?
Well, it's clear that communication is so important, particularly between China and the United States. It has been in the past, but it's more so today. I think that there continues to be concern in dealing with this issue of decoupling, that in some way that there is not any fear on the part of the United States that in doing business that somehow some of the technologies that the United States has that could be contributing to China are being used for purposes within the military. One of the concerns, of course, that did arise was having the director of the FBI here appear and make clear that China has rapidly been trying to expand its ability to in some way cut off the infrastructure in the United States should it ever need to do that. And so that was somewhat concerning, and an alarm bell that really had not been rung in the past few years here in Washington to the extent that it was by the director of the FBI.
Victor, what do you make of that? Is that one of China's goals, to expand the ability to cut off key vital infrastructure here in the United States?
Well, the Chinese government has dismissed such allegations as pure fabrication, because from the Chinese perspective, the United States is not an enemy. The United States is a country for China to fully engage with in peace and for mutual benefit. Therefore, from the Chinese perspective, don't get us wrong. The United States is not an enemy, is not an adversary, and the world will be big enough to accommodate both China and the United States. And for these two countries to get along with each other, to understand each other better, rather than to second-guess each other and always agitate for war. That's the wrong thing to do. That will lead to mutual destruction and Armageddon for mankind.
Klaus, good to have you with us in the studio. Foreign Minister Wang Yi also held a meeting with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, as well as the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. That took place on the sidelines of the conference. German companies have been increasing investments in China, and China has been, for the past 8 years, Germany's most important trading partner. So how would you characterize this relationship?
The relationship is constructive, but not without difficulties, and that is probably one of the reasons why Scholz and Wang Yi were talking, because they needed to overcome difficulties. Above all, what is being criticized is, of course, the subsidy culture in China. The EU has started an investigation into subsidies for EV vehicles, now also into a train operator in China, which has concluded a treaty with the Bulgarians.
Europeans also subsidize.
Absolutely. No, both sides are subsidizing. Who is subsidizing more is difficult to know, but the EU believes, obviously, that the Chinese are subsidizing more, so they have started an investigation. Scholz has made clear that Europe and Germany itself does not want to decouple from China. There's no question about that, because, as you said, economic relations are very intensive, but there is a need to de-risk. And he also keeps repeating that, particularly in certain very vital technologies, which are also of military relevance. And I think that was one of the topics which the two men discussed in Munich. Munich was a very important conference, but it also was a gloomy conference with two wars going on in Gaza, obviously, still in Ukraine. Then also it was overshadowed by two people. That was Navalny, who died in prison in Russia under very strange circumstances. Putin is being made responsible for that. And the other person who overshadowed the conference was Donald Trump, who said that he might not feel committed to NATO if he were re-elected in November. All that made people very worried and very gloomy.
I want to get to that in a moment. But there was a report in the Washington Post which quoted European officials. They were not named. They just said European officials are also saying that they will take tougher action on China if the United States displays a more committed effort to Ukraine's war effort and shows more support for NATO. I mean, what do you make of that? Because, in essence, Europe is saying, well, look, we're prepared to damage this relationship with China if you are nicer to Ukraine and nicer to us.
I'm not quite sure how important that official was. That certainly is not governmental policy. It's not the policy of EU Commission President von der Leyen. But what is needed clearly is that the United States shows a much stronger commitment to Ukraine than the American Congress is doing at the moment. The American government, but the Biden government, is very strongly behind Ukraine. But the Congress, the Republican members of Congress, that is a problem at the moment. We are still waiting for that passing of 60 billion aid for Ukraine, and the Europeans themselves have passed such a law over 50 billion recently, so they are waiting for the United States to do its bit. The Ukrainians are running out of bullets at the front line. They are clearly in an increasingly difficult position regarding the Russian onslaught. So there is a lot of pressure, and I think justified pressure, on the American Congress to do its bit and to stand by Ukraine, as they promised many times in the past.
Yeah, that 50 billion, which has been promised by the European Union, that's over the next 3 years.
Absolutely.
The IMF has already said that Ukraine has a serious funding shortfall. In fact, just for this year, it's 40 billion.
The German Chancellor also had a meeting with Zelensky, and they signed a security treatment, and the German Chancellor said for the next 10 years that agreement will be enforced, and the Germans will do what they can to support Ukraine. And that also applies to other European countries. Whether that is sufficient, we will find out. I have no idea whether that is sufficient and what the Ukrainians really need, both in ammunition and military equipment, but also in money to keep their country going. And for infrastructure, for living expenses, and so on, resources, and so on.
Okay. All right, let's go to Anton Fedyashin. Anton, great to see you. This Munich Security Conference this year was the largest ever, actually, 900 delegates, including 50 heads of state. But I'm wondering how relevant it was, because the two countries, which arguably could be the most important to world security right now, or at least up there with the rest of them, would be Russia and Iran. They were not there. In fact, organizers of this conference said that these two countries were, quote, not interested in meaningful dialogue. I mean, can there be meaningful discussions without Russia, without Iran?
Well, no, unfortunately, there can't be. And we can't say that the Russians are not interested. They've been ready for dialogue. But the dialogue's not coming their way. Everyone's waiting for them to lose the war. Unfortunately for Ukraine, they seem to be winning it for now. We seem to be in a holding pattern, and I'm not quite sure at this point what the West is waiting for, because even with the money that the EU has allocated to Ukraine, if I've understood correctly all of the reports around the 50 billion over 4 years, none of that is going to go to weapons. And of the 60 billion that everyone is waiting for the US Congress to authorize, only part of that is going to go to weapons for Ukraine. And even more importantly, the weapons have to be there, and most of them are actually not. So it's not like there are stocks of weapons on the Ukrainian border and, NATO forces are waiting for an invoice to be cleared. The weapons have to be made, so we're looking at months and years in some cases for this to be delivered. Meanwhile, the Russians are remorselessly taking ground, and I heard the piece that you played about Vladimir Zelensky saying that the Ukrainian forces have not retreated, the Russians haven't gained anything. Everything on the ground speaks to the exact opposite. So things are not looking good for Ukraine, and it's remarkable that diplomacy and peace negotiations didn't really sound very frequently at the Munich conference, important as it is.
You know, Anton, you say there is a holding pattern right now, but if you listen to American officials as well as European officials, their aim and goal appears to be the defeat of China, of Russia rather, by that meaning getting Russia totally out of Ukraine, including Crimea.
Right, exactly. And you're absolutely right, Anand. It's just that the facts on the ground seem to be going in the diametrically opposite direction, militarily and economically. Look, the IMF is constantly updating its figures. Russia had the best performing economy in Europe in 2023, and the IMF is now increasing its prediction for Russian economic growth in 2024. Putin is still in power. There's no sign of regime change in Moscow. I don't think that the West had a plan B when it launched its sanctions blitzkrieg and began to supply Ukraine with weapons. And I think there's a desperate sort of search for an alternative, but I didn't see any signs, at least not in public statements at the Munich conference, of a plan B being formulated.
Victor Gar, on the Ukraine war, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he said that China is working to promote peace, but conditions are not ripe for the two warring parties to start negotiations right now. Now, some European leaders view that as support for Russia. What is the Chinese position on a diplomatic solution to that conflict? And how much leverage can China bring to that effort?
I think from the day when the war broke out back in 2022, almost 2 years ago, China's position has been consistent, calling for ceasefire. And then I understand it would involve delineation of a line of actual control, and hostilities will need to cease along the line of actual control. And the line of actual control will not be considered the border between Russia and Ukraine. And Ukraine will hold on to the sovereignty and territorial integrity. It will be treated as a member of the United Nations. And given time, Russia and Ukraine will need to go through a process to eventually reach an agreement as to how their border should be delineated. This will really bring time to restore peace and restoring normal living conditions for the people in Ukraine, stopping the onslaught of the people. Now, the current strategy doesn't work because Russia has been holding to the position that if Russia will be defeated in Ukraine, then they will escalate the war from conventional war to nuclear war. And then disasters may happen not only to Russia and Ukraine themselves, but to other countries in the world. This will really make the whole situation worse. We want to save Ukraine, of course, but we want to save mankind at the same time. Therefore, this is time for philosophy, for wisdom, for foresight, for vision, rather than for one-sided audacity to promote your own geopolitical interest at the expense of civilian lives in Ukraine.
Klaus, looking at European support for Ukraine, you mentioned the $50 billion, which has been approved by the EU for Ukraine over the next 3 years. Now, we're also hearing that 18 members of NATO have agreed to meet that 2% target on defense expenditure. That's 2% of GDP. How does that change things in Europe? Will that significantly change things as far as Ukraine is concerned?
A little bit it will. But it certainly reassures the United States that Europe is doing its bit, that Europe is not laggard in looking after its own defense. That is what Donald Trump or what the American Congress has been asking for many years, and rightly so. So in that way, the Europeans are improving a lot their defense exposure. Whether that will help the Ukrainians in a really decisive way, this is of course questionable. The situation on the ground does not look good. 20% of Ukrainian territory is still in the hand of Russia. So any agreement on that basis, of course, would reward the aggressor. And that is the question. Should we really reward the aggressor? And also, if there was some sort of peace agreement, can we trust Putin to actually honor that peace agreement? Or will it just be a pause of a couple of years and then Russia will go at it again? We should remember that Russia invaded Moldova in the early 1990s. It invaded Georgia in 2008, and both countries lost territory to Russia up to this day. So the Ukrainians will probably suffer the same fate. In a way, one has to make a stand and say Putin cannot get away with his aggression. We just heard reports that the Russians may be capable of putting a nuclear bomb into space to blackmail any future enemy, to threaten the
That
possible...
was just from the American side.
Absolutely, but I don't know if these reports are totally true or not, but that these reports have been come out. At least an element of truth is in it, that at least the Russians are working on that process. That doesn't indicate a peaceful Russia in the future. It indicates a very aggressive Russia. And that is, of course, the dilemma we are all faced with, that we have an aggressive country in the middle of Europe, which should not be
But just to be clear, Klaus, you do not believe that this conflict is going to be resolved on the battlefield, do you?
Not really, no. But can we resolve it on the basis that Putin just backs what he has already achieved? Shouldn't Putin, if he's really interested in a peace negotiation, also offer to give up some of the territory he has gained? You know, why should only the Ukrainians give up and suffer and give up things while Putin is just being the hero of the show? I think that should not be allowed.
All right, James, you know, Klaus mentioned U.S. funding earlier on. Now, there is this $60 billion, which has been, this package, which is stuck in Congress right now. I mean, is sort of further funding for Ukraine really being held hostage right now to domestic politics in an election year?
There's no question that it has been held hostage, but do understand that the United States Senate has passed the necessary appropriations for Ukraine, and it appears that really the stumbling block has been the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. There are those here in Washington, D.C., where I am, that have been saying that if the bill got to the floor of the House, that it would pass without any question. But it is a matter of trying to figure out whether or not the Speaker is going to allow that to happen.
Anton, there was a German member of the European Parliament, Hannah Neumann. She said there is no question that Europe does, in fact, prefer Biden to win the election in November. But ultimately, for Europe, it doesn't really matter who wins, whether it's Biden or whether it's Trump, that Europe has to step up its own security game. I mean, is it surprising that we always hear about, you know, security and not about negotiations?
No, it's not surprising because For the Europeans, not paying for their security has become a tradition. It's a Cold War tradition when the United States carry the load. It's good that the Europeans are stepping up now. Jens Stoltenberg mentioned the figure that of the members of the alliance, the amount, those who actually meet the 2% threshold has increased from 3, he mentioned, in 2014 to 17 of 31 members today. So that's over half, but it's still not the full bloc. The Europeans are going to depend on the Americans more and more. Moreover, the decoupling of Europe from Russian energy supplies, especially cheap and reliable gas, is only going to make the economic situation in Europe worse. And so for all of the talk of the Europeans paying for their own defense and maybe even establishing a European army, which is also decades in the works, they're going to have to find money for that, while at the same time being productive and competitive and balancing their budgets and supporting their own populations and pouring money into Ukraine. And at the end of the day, I don't see how the Europeans are going to be able to balance all of that. In other words, keep all of those balls in the air. I think the first condition is going to be negotiations and end to the war in Ukraine, the reestablishment of economic ties with Russia, at least in some proportion, and then European defense.
That is something of a challenge for Europeans, isn't it? Especially for Germany. I mean, does it spend money on defense when its economy is struggling? Energy prices are also very high right now. It's impacting European economies. We've got the United Kingdom, which has gone into recession, and there was a report today that Germany has slipped into recession.
Absolutely. There's a big challenge going on in Europe, but I'm much more optimistic than Anatol. For example, look at energy. It was thought unbelievable that the Germans and the other Europeans could wean themselves off Russian oil and gas, and they did so totally within just over a year. And they're now not dependent at all on Russian energy. It costs them a lot, yes, they have economic difficulties, but we should not forget that these are all very rich countries. They are the richest countries in the world. They can manage to increase their security and also not have economic bankruptcy. It will be difficult, it will not be easy, clearly. There is a challenge. Just one word about Trump and Biden. I think that is not just about security, it is also about a transatlantic cooperation in many other fields. Think how Trump treated the Europeans. He shouted at them, he pushed them aside. He didn't want to cooperate and talk to them even. Think of Trump and Angela Merkel. That was a disaster, that relationship. Think of Biden and Olaf Scholz. They are very close allies and they cooperate very closely. So I think it goes beyond security, much more beyond than that.
And we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington, D.C.